tool for finance. I'm your host or moderator, I guess that would be the best way to put it, Jon Hansen. The webinar today is going to run an hour, and what I'd like to do is provide you with what you call, I guess, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, to understand using WebEx, your audio is provided through your computer speakers only. If you run into any technical issues during the webinar itself, you can contact technical support via the email on the screen. So, again, avail yourself of that if you encounter any challenges. In terms of using WebEx, a few points here, tips for using WebEx, receiving teleconference info in the chat box. And one thing, you're going to want to use the chat box because this is going to be very much an interactive experience where myself, along with our guests, Agnes Lind and Tony Uphoff, will be interacting not only with ourselves but hoping to have a dialogue with you as well. There'll be interactive polls, and we'd certainly encourage you to ask questions in that regard. Now, as we move forward, let me talk about Magnus Lind. And I won't read the whole paragraph. Magnus, very shortly, a condensed version, and maybe if you want to add something there, you can do so. But Magnus Lind is a financial strategist, influencer, author, speaker, investor, international entrepreneur, and a former officer in the Swedish Army. In other words, he's a very busy guy, and he's just written a book, just released, called Finance Unleashed, Leveraging the CFO for Innovation, which he co-authored with Kelly Barner. And Magnus, we both know Kelly. I sort of co-authored a book with her as well, Procurement at a Crossroads. So welcome, Magnus. And I think you just received word not long ago that your book was recognized as one of the top 5 CFO books to read in 2018.
That's correct. Yeah, we're very happy for that. And we're lucky to have Kelly. You don't have to be translated from Swedish to English, but also that she helped me do. Yeah. So, if I just can say a short thing about Finance Unleashed. When Kelly and me came up with that term, we realized that no one else had used it. So we now dominate the three first pages of Google with it, and we realized that finance has been leashed. But it's now time to unleash it, and that is what the excitement is all about.
All right. Well, you know what? This is appropriate background for the type of information we're going to be covering today. So, Magnus, I'm very delighted to have you join us. I also want to welcome Tony Uphoff, who is the president and CEO of Thomas. And Tony, we've, of course, shared the virtual airwaves before on my radio show. But one of the things in looking at your bio, and you joined them in January 2017, it stood out, sort of talked about this into the green room, is that amongst the background in the areas that you've worked, you were a CEO with UBM TechWeb, where you helped transform a declining print-centric business into a fast-growing digital media live and marketing services powerhouse. Now, while those who may not be familiar with Thomas's background, they go back over 100 years and have made, and I think you alluded to, made many what you would call evolutionary changes to adjust over that period of time. And you're now leading the charge and leading that ship in terms of moving into the digital era. Is that correct?
Boy, it sure is, John. And first off, thanks, and my thanks to you and Magnus, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. I have been in the front seat of the roller coaster, if you will, for digital transformation. And if you look at Thomas as a company, I'm thrilled to be a part of both the legacy but the future of Thomas. It's a 120-year-old company that went from print directories to CD-ROMs to website to now a platform and data business. It's really a remarkable story of innovation and adaptation to a market. Relevant to the discussion we're about to have, each month we get, just from procurement professionals, about 55,000 visits from procurement professionals that are sourcing products and suppliers and actionable information on our ThomasNet platform. And those 55,000 procurement professionals are generating about 210,000 visits over the course of that month, so roughly once a week. So it's really relevant for our discussion today that I'm hoping I can add some insights into some of the subtleties and nuances of what's going on in the market.
Well, see, and add dimension, of course, is that we're going to be actually touching on or referring to a study or a survey that Thomas did in conjunction with Dun & Bradstreet, which adds another dimension of understanding that I think is going to be important here. So, again, welcome. I'm glad to have you join us. Now,
Thanks,
look, of course, there's my bio. Some of you who haven't tuned into webinars in the past here will not be necessarily familiar with me, but I am the chief editor and a writer for Procurement Insights blog, and I also host a radio show since March of 2009 called the PI Window on the World Show, which has aired more than 800 episodes. Again, if you want to know a little bit more about me, please feel free when you get the on-demand version. You can certainly read through that screenshot there. Now, I want to move on to remind you that we're going to be doing a tweet chat. If you're not familiar with that, as we get poll results, we usually like to post them to Twitter, and we assign a hashtag to that. And the hashtag for today's webinar is FinTech18. Now, besides posting the poll results, we also engage those who weren't able to attend this morning's webinar or who may, again, have attended but have something to add. So it creates a great dialogue box. And again, it'll go live about 30 minutes after the conclusion of the webinar. One of the interesting things, however, I want to note is that the discussion sometimes goes on for a week or two afterwards. So, again, if you have something to add, if you have more questions, if you want to expand the scope of the discussion, be part of that with other industry thought leaders, again, the tweet chat hashtag is FinTech18. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't, of course, pause for the cause and thank Zycus for hosting this organization or this webinar. Zycus is a leading global provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement or performance solutions. And some of the features of course, is that they are recognized as a Gartner Magic Quadrant leader, and certainly in the Forrester Wave e-procurement Q2 2017. Their features of their solutions include touchless processing from PO to invoice, guided buying for catalog and non-catalog items, PO-backed invoice and contract-backed invoice payment, as well as a myriad of other great features that I would invite you or encourage you to investigate a little further. And I just want to prompt you at this point that at the conclusion of the webinar, the Zycus page or landing page will prop up and provide you with some additional worthwhile information. So, again, I think we're ready to start. Let's focus, gentlemen, on the three areas of the agenda. And, again, I want to encourage you out there who are attending, if you have any questions, avail yourself of the chat room to ask them. We're going to focus on three areas. At the crossroads of credit and risk, we're going to talk credit from the supplier side of the road, and finally, credit from the buyer finance side of the road. And now, to get started with this, one of the things that we're going to look for is what does managing supplier credit have to do with risk? And I mean, it seems like it's an interesting question. It may even seem like an obvious question to some, but let's kick this off with a poll. To what degree does effectively managing supplier risk or credit reduce or eliminate risk? Significantly, moderately, minimally, or not sure? And while you take a moment or two to respond to that, I'm going to turn to start with you first, Tony, and then go to you, Magnus. Managing supplier credit. How does it reduce or eliminate risk? What do you think the response is going to be?
Boy, I'm going to guess that it is significantly, and it would be interesting if we looked at this over a period of time. I think this is growing in importance, and so I think the significantly is going to be, if there was levels of significance here, John, I think you're going to see from most people today this is an increasing need. We'll get into the challenge of doing it in a few minutes.
All right. Magnus, what are your thoughts?
Well, I also think it would be significant. The reason is obviously you think about customer credit risk is high, but if what happens if you lose a supplier? So that is the case also, and we have this what I call working capital starvation game, where the big buyer with a lot of money forces the suppliers to fund them, and that creates quite a big risk, not maybe in a time like this, but in a time of financial stress. So I would definitely think significantly, yeah.
Well, now, there's one thing that I want to look at, and it looks like we're getting 67% saying significantly. it'll certainly give you the idea relative to sharing your same sentiments with that regard. But one of the things I want to ask, and we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, is finance and credit management has an impact on procurement, but it's obviously been in the realms of the finance department itself. And of course, those two groups never necessarily mesh together to a certain degree. I mean, what kind of impact did that have? Like, is there an understanding of the decisions that were made traditionally in the finance department? Was there a thorough understanding of the impact it would have on procurement performance? I'll go to you, Tony.
You know, I think what we can clearly see happening across our audiences, and I'll use the kind of our data shows approach here, John, if I can, which is, so I mentioned before the number of procurement professionals that use ThomasNet. We also have engineers, we have MROs, and we have some finance people that would fit into the ecosystem here. So it's fascinating for us to watch the various components come together. We also recently completed a research study with a company called Stratogen Research, where we looked at the importance of tasks by each of those functions, and then the most frustrating tasks. And interestingly enough, collaboration across functions was in the top 10, and the most frustrating challenge they all face is the ability to collaborate. So to use your example, John, you know, I think the need for finance, and I love the unleashing finance metaphor there, Magnus. I think for today, I think you know, it's a team sport, but I think understanding how does that work, and how do we communicate, and how do we engage in and around that. And by the way, don't forget engineering. I know that's not the theme here, but you know, there's at least 2, if not 3 legs to this stool to get it right. So I think the need to collaborate is going up. I'm not so sure that it's always as elegant as perhaps companies would like, or as clear of how to get that process of, you know, who's in control, how do we do that, how do we get the right input from both functions, if that makes sense.
Well, Magnus, anything to add to what Tony had to say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the logistical supply chain or the physical supply chain that the procurement works with daily can manufacture a car in 18 hours. But the lack of chain view on the financial can manage a cross-border payment in 48 hours. So what I think the benefit of collaboration with finance and procurement is that procurement can provide a supply chain understanding. And what I agree also with, we have done research also, and 58% of the finance people say we need to have better cross-functional cooperation within the company. I would say we actually need it between, with all the companies in the supply chain, all the major suppliers and distributors. So what we have to bridge in some way, and then when we are bridging these two functions, I think what are different parties good at? I mean, if you look at finance, they know credit, they know risk very well in the sense of financial risk. The procurement, they know supply chain, they know Lean Sigma, Six Sigma, they know that kind of thinking. And we, in the book, we are talking about the financial supply chain, which we don't have today. If you see working capital, how finance work with process management to improve, they only look in their own balance sheet. And that, I think, is a big, big problem. And then that is why they don't really, we talk about credit, but it's credit risk not only in the first-tier supplier, not only in the first-tier customer, in the whole chain, right? So we have, I believe, and that is why we have done lease finance, to be able to work closely with procurement to try to enforce Lean Six Sigma and financial risk management over the whole supply chain.
Well, now this is an interesting, and sorry to interrupt there, Meg, but this is an interesting point you're making, and it's a theme that I want to touch on, and we will touch on as we get into the next sections of this webinar, is that the element between finance and purchasing and its progression, I think, are a key point we want to focus on from both sides of the equation. But overall, what both of you have said is that, again, it is important. And in fact, Tony, the disconnect over financial risk in the supply chain survey and poll to which I referred that you, as well as Bradstreet did, indicated that for many, assessing financial operational stability during the supplier evaluation is important. Now, so let me ask you this question. In terms of the assessment, how do you go about, what tools are available, I mean, in terms of being able to get into the financial model relative to understanding the viability of suppliers, especially if the buyer, to a certain degree, contributes to that financial viability. Do you understand what I'm saying, Tony?
Yeah. Boy, I sure do, John. I think this is an enormous challenge. And if you look at the supply chain of the vast majority of companies, they are made up of relatively small to medium-sized businesses, the vast majority of which are private companies. And that in and of itself creates an interesting dynamic. So while we partner with and work with Dun & Bradstreet, Dun & Bradstreet does a fairly good job of that, but the reality of it is there isn't any company, there isn't any data source that has completely detailed financials on small to medium private companies. And that's an enormous part of the issue here, ripped from the headlines, right? So our latest Thomas Index report, we were looking at demand trends by specific categories, and we were noting that Tesla, and this has been in the news, that Tesla had made some commitments in their supply chain that it turns out they picked the wrong suppliers. And so they're having to go back and rework components, and it's actually dragging back some of the production of Tesla's automobiles. Now, you know, at the end of the day, if you look at that, one of the challenges could be the financial management of those companies, but it also could be the technical capabilities of some of those small to medium suppliers. It is not an easy process to go through. So my sense of it is twofold. There are tools that are available, John, to answer the question directly, and you know, sources like Dun & Bradstreet and others are there. The reality of that is, though, when you talk to these small to medium suppliers, they're not actively participating with Dun & Bradstreet, which means that the data has some thin, you know, use or value. And I think the most of the time that when a credit report like that is used, it's literally probably something that's stapled to a PO. It's probably not actually, you know, all that significant in the decision tree. I think what's happening here is the need to develop a relationship with suppliers. And I think part of that is gaining some level of knowledge that you can do some exploratory work on platforms certainly like ThomasNet, but also at some point, if this is going to be a volume supplier, right, they're going to produce at volume, and it would have a material risk if this supplier went down. I think what you're seeing is more and more companies are developing a direct relationship with these suppliers, and that likely means they may ask for financial information that isn't contained in a report from a credit service like Dun & Bradstreet.
All right, now, Magnus, building on what Tony had just said as well, and as you can see the infographic coming up here from the aforementioned survey done by both Thomas and Dun & Bradstreet, only 15% of buyers do not assess financial stability. 53% of buyers have eliminated a potential supplier due to poor business credit profile. So if you look at that, there is information available. They are making decisions, but how do you from a buyer side and a finance procurement relationship side build those relationships that Tony had alluded to that give you the necessary information beforehand rather than after the fact? So you move from a react mode to a proact mode. How do you do that?
Well, that is the hard thing, because we are in a period now when we are assessing how really do you define financial stability. Because, you know, most companies, if they don't have revenues for 3 months, they're gone. And if they're small companies, they are very dependent on a few customers, and one of those customers could be you. And also on top of that, if you ask a founder or an entrepreneur that runs a small company, how are your finances? I mean, they say it's fine. Huh? And then if you go to Dun & Bradstreet, what should they do? So the big problem with especially the small companies or the minor one are actually to to measure, and I see that we have in the chat, we have what the metrics are, financial metrics, and that is really, really hard. And I think the only way, the only way to do it is have a close relationship. So you have a close relationship on the balance sheet as you have on the production floor, because many times it is payment terms that is differs, because there is an ecosystem fight in the financial supply chain, which means that we push payment terms and let's see if they scream. I mean, I know big companies that send out email or letters saying we push another 14 days now, but you have to do that you would never say that, okay, in the physical supply chain, you would never treat the supplier like that, but in financial supply chain, you do that. So you need a lot more, credit rating or financial stability for even mid-sized companies is very, very real time. So going to Dun & Bradstreet and see what happened last year doesn't really make sense.
Can I add something to, John, can I add something to Magnus's point there? I'll tell you, we have, somewhere around 10,000 plus suppliers that advertise with us to reach in market buyers, across, procurement and engineering and the various functions. And when you talk to the ones that would fit into the category of small to medium, most of these are very thriving businesses, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years. Has been a resurgence in U.S. manufacturing. Frankly, most of them have a vested interest in staying private. They're not only not going to disclose to D&B, they're very careful of who they explain the size and scope of their business to. So there's an odd dynamic at play here where I don't want to call it lack of transparency, but a lot of these providers are running very good-sized businesses, and they're very cautious about who gets access to what type of financial information that they release.
So this raises a question, though, and there's that old saying, I'm sure you've heard it, when everything is said and done, there's more said than done. Everyone recognizes, or even about the weather, everybody recognizes the need to get an understanding of managing the risk, credit, and all those elements of the relationship. But according to a study, including the Horizon 2017 panel discussion that I moderated last year, one of the things that came out is that very few, in fact, only 20% or less than 20% actually do any type of due diligence on their suppliers. So, I mean, it's an interesting point that we're all making, that it can be difficult to access information, the reliability of information that's available. But at the end of the day, the buying side isn't doing, at least according to the panel discussion, isn't doing anywhere near as much as to managing that type of risk. I mean, does that surprise you a little bit, Tony?
Yes and no. It surprises me because, in the spirit of gap analysis, that's a huge gap, right? When clear need, but, how many are taking action against the need? I'll add a little bit of a data point in here too, John, that I think is relevant. So the Stratogen research that I mentioned before, we looked at over 200 tasks that procurement professionals, and they ranked as most important. In the top 10 was eliminating suppliers with poor reputations from consideration. So that's in the top 10 out of 200 plus tasks. So it's very high rated. Of the most frustrating tasks in the top 20 was keeping track of suppliers' business changes. So I think maybe the answer to this is not it's not about the gap of, hey, you say this is important, but you don't appear to be taking action in the straightforward way. I think the how is complicated here, and I think that's been illuminated in multiple comments here. But I really think that may be a bigger issue than we realize. It is very difficult, particularly at scale. I don't know that when we start saying you have to have a direct relationship, that's not something that's simple to automate. Right, that requires human plus machine, processes and systems here a little bit. So I don't know if I'm coming at the question the right way for you, John, but that's what it stimulates in my mind.
Well, actually, you are. And Magnus, as I hand this one off to you for a couple of moments just to give a brief comment. I mean, isn't this where the advent of robotic process automation and AI comes in? Because, when you were saying what you did, Tony, they know what they have to do is just not easy or easy to do. I'm reminded of that quote by Boxnet founder about Uber saying, we have to build solutions for the way in which the world should work, not the way in which the world does work. I mean,
yes.
dovetailing this into your area, Matt, and with your depth of financial background, for those listening who, again, are CFOs in the finance world, I mean, is it a matter of the emerging technologies? Is it a matter of the fact that now what they're going to do is eliminate the need for people to do those redundant tasks that are often very, very time-consuming, and thus freeing them up to focus on more strategic parts of the business? I mean, is that really where this digital revolution or evolution comes into play, that it does create the avenues of opportunity to build that rapport that is necessary to assess or ascertain the veracity of your supply chain?
Yeah, I think we will cooperate differently. We will cooperate because in the finance side, you involve, suddenly we will onboard Dun & Bradstreet or a bank or a credit institution when we can talk directly. If you see that you want to buy something like an engine or something from a supplier, you don't involve a third party, maybe for certification, but you don't do that when you want to develop something. But in the finance chain, we are doing that. We are taking these credit institutions. And I think we are going away from that because there are other ways to assess the financial stability. I want to turn the discussion a little bit up around. What happens if you are buying or if you want to buy something from a company who doesn't have such a good balance sheet? What you do, you say, I don't buy it, but it's the best that's out there. You do something to remedy financial situation. You maybe pay in advance, you maybe do a loan, whatever. This is what I mean. I mean, what we are clearly seeing is that the physical chain has been separated for the past 200 years from the financial chain. The financial chain has gone via banks and special vehicles, right? And the physical chain we have had control over together with our suppliers and distributors. And always when we do something finance, we involve a bank. I think what we are seeing here, we are seeing companies like DHL, UPS, and others. They are actually lending money to their supply chain or to their customers. They are a distributor for the banking money to this. So we are seeing the physical and financial supply chain to merge. And then, of course, we will change the way we work with finance. So then there is another part with this innovation. We have to remember that if we are pushing or if we are starving our suppliers from cash, they will not be able to innovate. And if we are a big company, all research is clear on this. If we are a huge company, disruptive innovation is something we just don't do. We are not good at that. We are good at incremental refinement of products, but disruptive is very, very hard.
Well, you know what, let me just interrupt you there for a minute, because you know what, we're having such a great discussion, but we only have an hour to do this. I could talk to you all day about this. But it leads in what you both have just said is, you know, who owns credit risk management in regard to that, and dovetails into, we're going to break down in the next two sections. We're going to break down from the supplier side and also from the buyer side, because Magnus, I think what you talked about here is there's a cause and effect relationship in terms of how buyers interact with their suppliers, and that perhaps some of the challenges and risks are a result of decisions made with regards to payment of invoices and other elements that have a direct impact on that chain. So, you know, but you know, and this speaks to the credit risk management element. I mean, when we talked at the panel discussion at Horizon 2017, it was like everyone said, yes, risk is important, we've got to manage it, we've got to do all of these things. Yet when we asked the question, who owns risk, it sort of went, well, maybe it's the legal department, or, you know, so, I mean, there is some confusion in terms of that. Could that, to a certain degree, Magnus, and then quickly to you, Tony, and then we'll go into the next section, that question of ownership be an issue in terms of who's responsible for what and at what point? Yeah.
We have to remember that the finance department history is working inside out, and CPOs are working outside in, or working with externally. Finance department doesn't do that at all. So if you ask, if I broaden it a bit, because credit risk is one of the risks you have, there are other financial risks also in supply chain. Who owns the financial supply chain? If you look at the physical chain, they are usually a coordinator, right? But in the financial chain, that chain isn't even defined. So there's not a coordinator, and this is the problem. And the legal department, I think, would be very weird to put this on. I would expect the treasurer and the procurement work closely together, and we see that in the area of supply chain finance, reverse factoring, dynamic discounting, that they have, with the help of those suppliers in that, the supply chain finance vendors, have started to bridge the gap. Yeah. One of the big problems is that the CPOs, or challenges, I think, we need to handle is the common language. I mean, even if you speak English, CPOs and treasurers just don't talk the same language.
Well, okay, now, you know what, I'm going to interrupt here, and then I want to get to a question from Ethel. And sorry, Ethel, it took me a minute or two, but it just popped up on the screen. But you know, that's a whole nother discussion there, I think, Magnus, is because as supply chains get extended globally, you're now dealing with a whole an introduction of a whole new series of issues dealing with language, communication, all of these other factors that come into play. So, I mean, it leads into a very interesting point, and I want to weave Ethel's question into this now and start directing it to you, Tony, because we got to start doing it domestically, I guess, before you can do it internationally or internally, before you can do it externally. I mean, can you tell me what are some of the metrics, Ethel asks, do you look for when you're picking a supplier? So, Tony, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, boy, is that the right question, Ethel? And I think there's a series of things that are important. So let me back up to go forward on it. I think, you know, one of the common things that's happening right here, and we've seen these trends before. I remember watching this as business technology started to sweep across business, and who owns technology? How do you adopt it? Is it owned at the you know, application level or the centralized level? And then the next thing you know, we woke up and realized we're all using technology. We're all both stakeholders, but also there's a centralized level of ownership. I think we may see a similar paradigm, evolve here. But Ethel, to your question, I think it is it's tricky to say the least today, and I think it is a combination of quantitative details and qualitative details. And I think on the qualitative details, understanding the quality, the scale, and the service delivery of a supplier is huge. And I think Magnus has really well outlined. I'm not saying the financial health of that supplier doesn't matter. It certainly does. But I think that's only one piece of the puzzle, because I think depending on the size of your organization, you may find a very unique supplier of a custom component. One of our customers is a relatively small business. I'm going to guess somewhere between $5 and $10 million a year, and they supply some very sophisticated individual manufactured components for Hyperloop. And they're one of the few companies that does this. They're providing this in volume. Now, they're not a particularly big company. My guess is a financial analysis of their business would show something around the numbers I mentioned. But I think in watching how that particular deal went down, it was a combination of the quality of their product and service, their ability to scale within reasonable limits of what in this case, Hyperloop technology was going to need in terms of volume, and then a relationship clearly developed between the folks at Hyperloop and understanding those quality issues, which were probably more driven by engineering, but then also, how can we work with you, and are there credit terms here that make sense? Magnus said something before I thought that was really, really appropriate to introduce here. A lot of smaller to medium-sized suppliers don't want to work with Fortune 100 companies, and the reason they don't is they can't deal with the terms. They can't do cash flow. They can't, they can't go to 120-day payment terms. Their businesses don't operate that way. So we will literally have customers of ours that will say, hey, I'm not as interested in the Fortune 100 companies. So I think there's depending on the size of company you're working for, I think it's that combination of, certainly there's some price points and metrics and things that are really important for you to look at, and you've got limits to what you think those are. But I think the qualitative discussion around, can you produce a high quality product in volume at a predictable price, and can you actually deliver? in the volumes that we're looking for. And then I think there's that, I don't want to call it secondary, but there's that complementary conversation around, okay, now let's talk about payment terms and credit terms. But I think you have to get the first part of that right before you get into a discussion of the finance. Otherwise, you're just going to dismiss a bunch of suppliers that could be really powerful for you.
All right, so now let's dovetail into this, because this is an interesting point you raised about suppliers not wanting to deal with FP 100 companies. And, we're going to talk about that from the buyer side of the equation, because certainly there was an interesting automotive study that was done. To just leap a little bit ahead, saying that the buying organizations, the manufacturers who were able to offer a better quality product at a better price had a greater level of satisfaction amongst their supply base in dealing with them. And one of the contentious issues of the supplier relationship was the thing you alluded to, 120-day payout periods and not being able to do that. So I want you to store that in the back of your mind for when that comes up in that section, Tony. But let's go to the next section. Are suppliers aware of how their own financial risk is perceived? And again, maybe speaks to a certain degree relative to what Ethel was saying. How do I say this? It's a give and take relationship in terms of the interaction between the two. So let's start off with the poll. From a supplier's standpoint, or from your standpoint, what level of responsibilities do suppliers have regarding the strength of their credit position? Is it significant? Is it moderate? Is it minimal? Is it other? And so while we're waiting for them to respond to that, I want to just go back to Ethel's question, because I believe, Magnus, you had something to add to that as well. So if you could, in just a minute or so, Magnus, do you have anything else to say to Ethel?
Yeah, it's very hard to do financial stability reports analysis. If you see it from the entrepreneur side, the small company side, I've run small companies for quite some while. There's only one metric that you have to take shows only one, and that's cash flow, future cash flow, not historical, future cash flow.
Yeah.
Because if you can't pay your salaries, if you can't pay your taxes, if you can't pay your supplies in the end, it doesn't matter. So I would do cash flow, and then you need to consider what the cash flow is, because you can say, okay, we have a dynamic discounting, so when you ship the stuff to us, you can get paid in 10 days. Yeah, but it took me 15 months to deliver this stuff. And during those 15 months, I have needed to finance that. Who does that? And that is the big question. And you have to be open on cash flow, because it can be very, when you don't have cash, you become very nervous. So I would focus on only one thing in the start, because it's so difficult. How does your supplier's cash flow look like? Your future cash flow look like?
All right. Well, now, in terms of the poll results, and I'm just checking to see where we stand, it seems to be split 50-50, where some say significant, some say moderate. So basically the response from the audience is simply this, that relative to the strength of their own credit position, it is basically on the shoulders of the supplier to be able to know their positioning. Now, that's an interesting point, because if we go to a study from your, Tony, again, the survey from your work with Dun & Bradstreet, it comes back, it's like a blind spot, because suppliers don't have a clue for the most part as to what their current status of their business credit profile is, and only 18% of suppliers believe they needed to improve their business credit profile. So if you look at the buyer side of the equation, the finance side of the equation, and I'm assuming that we don't have any suppliers out in our audience today, they expect them to do it, yet the buyer or the suppliers don't. I mean, that's a big disconnect, isn't it?
John, it's huge, and I think there's perhaps, trying to theorize on what's behind the data here a little bit. There may be a few things that are driving this. I think a few we've already touched on, but if you look at the angle for a lot of these businesses, I think what it suggests is, while they are able to run and grow their businesses without having to be overly aware of what their credit profile is, their business credit profile. They know what their cash flow is, to Magnus's point, but they are probably, and I don't think it's just blissful ignorance here. I think that they're probably realizing, look, I am running and growing a thriving business, and I don't have to spend a lot of time trying to update credit reporting systems and things like that. And I think the 18% of suppliers believing, the low ebb there to improve their business credit profile, I think this probably suggests the value or perceived value of a business credit profile, not the value of having to disclose cash flow or other things that are financial. I loved Magnus's point on the singular financial metric there. So the discontinuity I think I see here is this is the supplier's statement about the value of credit reports to them and potentially to a buyer. I don't think it's that they think it's a great idea and they just aren't doing anything about it.
So in other words, and maybe, and that sort of goes into, and Magnus, I'll be with you in one moment, but that goes into what you said earlier, Tony, is the fact is we don't want to deal with FP 500 or 100 companies or top 100 companies, besides the extended credit, the scrutinizing along these lines is obviously going to be a little bit more robust, if I'm not mistaken. Is that another obstacle to engagement in that regard? And if it is, one has to wonder, who's missing out here? Suppliers could be missing out on a great opportunity for new business, but let's face it, historically speaking, the greatest innovations and breakthrough have come through small, medium enterprises. So if they're not being engaged by, let's say, the top 100 or the larger organizations in general, might they be missing out? I mean, that's one of the thoughts that came to mind. I mean, am I a little off base there?
I'll dive in and then I'll hand it to Magnus. I don't think you're off base, John, but I think it's an interesting observation that I think for an enormous number of suppliers, I think what they're basically saying is they can solve their potential customers' problems around needing to understand the health of their business without having to over-engineer a credit report. I really think that's what this is saying. Now, you're asking the appropriate question, which, boy, this is the $64,000 question, which is if they were to participate more actively and spend time on that, is that a growth driver for their business? And I think that's a question that's my gut instinct and experiential understanding would say, I think it probably is. I think it's an amount of the investment, though. If that investment in time and energy to do that, is it really going to make a material difference in my business as a supplier? And I think what this data shows very clearly is up to now, the supplier is saying, no, it really doesn't.
Okay, Magnus, anything to add?
No, I think the only thing I see on this is that what value does the credit profile really have for business? Because it's historical, right? So, and
good point, Magnus.
You say, sorry?
No, I'm saying it's a good point. It's a historic document, not a current document. Yeah.
So if you listen to, I had a CEO friend, and he said, how many good CFOs do I know? I asked him. 2. I know 500. 2 are good. And because only 2 walk with their faith for the future. So history doesn't really matter. And history can change really quickly. You can get a big order and then get a lot of money. You can get a big order, tie up a lot of working capital, and then suddenly your credit profile goes down. And the problem with credit profiles is if you really look at them and dive into it, what do they actually say? They say very, very little, and they are historical. So it's the past.
Okay,
so
but wait.
I'm
sure I have to ask this. Sorry to interrupt, Magnus, but I have to ask this because, and I do remember in the old days of the ERP era, where one of the biggest complaints that procurement had relative to getting data and reports out of the technology back then is that by the time it weaved its way through the submission process and the output process, it was usually a month or 2 old and long lost its relevance. Right. Are we not now, technologically speaking, and again, we're all talking about this digital transformation, are we not now in a better position to move beyond old data to real-time or just-in-time data?
In the financial supply chain, no. A cross-border payment takes 48 hours. That's not really
8 hours. Okay, 48 hours is still better than 30 days, though, isn't it? Or 60 days,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, but you make a car in 18 hours. So that is just to, but looking, I think when you go into a relationship with the supplier, you should say like this, okay, I want you to have these tolerances, blah, 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 in the physical chain, the product, actual product. And then you have to sit down, okay, if we pay you like this, you have the outgoing payment like this to your suppliers and to your to tax authorities, to your employees. How do this match up? Do we make your cash flow worse or better with this deal? So you have to join the physical and financial supply chains and really analyze, okay, how can you produce and how can you deliver these kind of products and how can you finance them? Because in the end, it has to be the customer who finances cash flow-wise. Otherwise, cash flow has to come from a third party. And that's very hard for a small company, and the banks hardly lend to them anymore. So then where does that money come from? Who is that third party? And why should the big company make the cash flow situation worse for the small supplier? That I think is a very relevant question.
Well, you know, now this is an interesting point because again, time flies when we're having a great discussion here. But the slide that's just on the screen now, and it ties into, it says 65% of suppliers feel sure that they have not lost business due to a poor credit profile. And if I can refer back to the earlier earlier slide, Tony, which came from the infographic through your work with Dun & Bradstreet, is that 63% of buyers have eliminated potential suppliers due to a poor business profile. I mean, it just seems that there is, and speaking of what Magnus is talking about in one area, but in a number of areas, there seems to be this great disconnect of not only the information, but also the understanding of what is and is not important. I mean, that's what I get from this infographic. Am I misreading something?
I don't think so, and I think what's fascinating about this discussion, John, is perhaps what we're seeing, this discontinuity, is really being driven by something that Magnus is illuminating, because what we're actually witnessing is the convergence of the physical and financial supply chains. That's what's actually happening here. And as we do that, there's likely going to be these snapshots, which is what research is. By the way, credit report is simply a snapshot. It's not a moving picture. We're going to take these snapshots of this, and we're likely going to find these discontinuities. And I don't know, you know, in the spirit of where the puck is going, if you will, as opposed to where it's been. My guess is some of these discontinuities will start to ebb and flow, but there very well could be some innovations. I mean, I don't want to segue the conversation into a blockchain discussion, but when you start to think about new and innovative technologies that are going to have a very, very disruptive impact in a positive way on transparency and a better understanding of supply chain and logistics, I think that some of what we're talking about may not be as simple as the supplier needs to do a better job of updating credit reports and make it easier for the procurement professional to see those credit reports. There's likely going to be an innovation here that you said this earlier, John. I don't want to use the term disruptive technology, but some new technology or combinations of technology or applications of existing technology, I think that will help bridge this. But boy, you talk about a fascinating area. I think Magnus is spot on with the idea of convergence of the physical and financial supply chains.
Okay. Well, now this sort of leads into, because we're talking about the disconnect, let's look at the buyer finance responsibility in terms of the relationship. And, you know, one of the infographics, again, that came up is that how many or how often have buyers been burned by suppliers' financial risk? 47% of buyers say they can cite examples of suppliers who suddenly failed to deliver or simply went out of business. 90% of those buyers have been burned at least once within the last 5 years. So this leads into an interesting question and our third and final poll. To what degree does buyer finance policies and practices impact supplier credit? Significantly, moderately, minimal, or others? And I'm asking this question because ultimately one of the things that come to mind here is that you know, and again, I'll go to what you said, Tony. Organizations, suppliers don't want to deal with top 100 companies, but I think the list is even bigger than that in terms of policies of engagement, is that, you know, they want to extend credit out to 120 days or transfer financial risk elements to suppliers who aren't in the position to handle that. Yet on the other side, and you know, there's on a supplier side, if they see a great opportunity, suppliers are taking on business that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily take on or shouldn't take on, that puts them in that position, or precarious position of risk. I mean, those are some of the things that come to mind here. I mean, I'll go to you, Magnus, first. I mean, are buyer finance organizations, the finance side of the equation, are they sometimes the author of supplier woes and failure?
Yes, very much. And that is what I'm saying is, how can you say, I'm going to buy this from, you're a big company, you have $2 billion in cash. And you buy something from a company that is having cash month to month only. And then you say, okay, we pay in 90 days, and you have from when you deliver, and you have to take all the financing. I mean, if you do that, I think that as a big company, as a big company, you are doing sorry, I'm sitting in a conference room and suddenly there's a, but you are doing a very big misfortune for yourself, because the big company has to understand what does the supplier, especially if the supplier is small, what is the impact of the supplier's cash flow from delivering to us? And if the supplier says, of course, they don't say, no, we don't want this order. They want as much order as they can. So they hide there, and then they say, I fixed the financial situation later on as long as I get this order. And then there's a lot of energy going to just getting the order, and then the finance, we fix that later on, and that didn't fix itself. I think that the buyer has made a strategic mistake to just expect that the small suppliers are going to finance them for free. And I think this is a big paradigm shift. And you saw the automotive in 2008, 9, and 10 that gone haywire because of that. You cannot deliver a car without steering wheel, right?
Well, you know what's
it is the buyer that has the responsibility to make sure that the supplier's cash flow isn't affected negatively of the order.
Well, now, and Tony, before I go to you, there's a couple of points. First of all, the survey results, and thank you for that insight. The survey results show, and I don't know, I'm a little bit surprised in terms of this, pleasantly surprised, but the majority felt that the supplier was indeed, or the buyer finance policies do in fact have an influence, and it verifies what a Supply Chain Dive 2017 article talked about in a couple of areas. And I just want to touch on these before I turn it to you. In the slide, it's usually a forgotten aspect. So financial stability is a forgotten aspect of supplier relations. Poor credit can often reflect, and this speaks to your point, Magnus, and going to you, Tony, poor credit can often reflect poor payment practices or high debt. Now, they say it could result in mismanaged disruptions, possibly, but you know, I highlighted this point when I read this because it doesn't necessarily have to be a disruption that causes this. It is again payment practices on the side of the finance and the buyer side of the equation, I think, come into play here, don't they, Tony?
Yeah, I agree, John, and I think, you know, this is another one of these fascinating kind of disconnects here. And I think if you look at this, you know, again, to use the metaphor that we've used of a large company dealing with a smaller supplier, right? I think one of the things to note here is Harvard does a lot of studies around business practices, and they use the term called policies to practices, which basically mean the big company has a policy, but in practice, it may not work exactly how the policy works. And so I think there's probably a little bit of that in this gap. I want to be clear, though. I think without question, the policies that are being dictated by companies are having an impact on the way the suppliers behave. There's no two ways about that. But I'd also go back to something that Magnus touched on earlier, which is, you know, we watch Fortune 100 buyers' behaviors just like we look at all the buyers. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating to us is how many RFIs, requests for informations, or direct connections they're making with small suppliers. And we can look at those suppliers ourselves and understand they don't have an up-to-date credit report and those types of things. But I go back to something Magnus said, there could be some innovation that the buyer at the larger company is going to forgo, because if I'm simply going to state a series of policies and that's it, and if you can't adhere to these policies, I'm not going to work with you, you're likely going to miss something. In another life, I did a big survey across chief information officers, and the biggest problem they had is they said the bigger they got, they were only dealing with huge vendors. And they had lost touch with small, innovative companies that were doing really cool, disruptive things that they needed to stay up on top of because of the volume of the kind of and the kind of requirements they had. So I don't want to get too far afield there, but I think this is, again, John, one of these fascinating kind of discontinuities. I want to be clear. Our data shows, and I would wholly support the idea, however, that as the buyer in this case puts together requirements, I think over time you're going to see suppliers adapt to this. I'm just not clear yet exactly how that adaptation might happen. It may not happen in a linear fashion, i.e. a credit report or other things that we've talked about.
Okay. Well, you know, now, again, we're getting into the last couple of minutes, so I just want to touch on things, both very good points. There's additional slides to you in the audience that will be made available on the download or on the on-demand version, certainly, that you can review and share. I've included some articles of what's the approach to do it. One such article appeared in Span Matters, where they referenced the Hackett Group report indicating that 32% of respondents are planning to extend their supplier payment terms. Seems to be the antithesis of what we're talking about today, but again, it maybe speaks to the bottom line of the disconnect. Pursuing a payment term extension with suppliers can unlock value in your supply chain. Preparation is the key. Payment term extension, Tony, we're talking about that again. The top 100 companies, organizations not wanting to deal with them, and I'd expand it beyond the top 100 because, you know, I think it's not limited the extension of payment terms to that group, certainly, you know, is the key. So organizations, finance people are still thinking of extending payments when what we're talking about here can actually undermine the relationship that I think, Magnus, you talked about is necessary to build into again. In the Span Matters, they have plans on what you can do to extend payments. And again, that speaks to, again, you know, the thought that this is still a thing. We've got to start extending payment terms. So, you know, let me ask you this question. With these examples that are given here, how can you make it all work? I mean, there seems to be a number of disconnects into the marketplace. So with about a minute each with what we have left, I'll start with you, Magnus, and then go to you, Tony. I mean, there does seem to be a disconnect that continues to bridge. How can we bridge that disconnect? Is it a digital answer in part because of the real-time capabilities or near real-time capabilities of today's platforms? Is it a mindset change? What exactly has to take place to bridge these disconnects? And I'll go to you, Magnus, first, and then you, Tony.
You had a slide before that saying something like extending payment terms unlock value. I think that is BS. Sorry for using, but I'm Swede, so I'm not so good using exact words. But you don't unlock value. I mean, what is happening is that the big company is pushing the suppliers to get money later, and then the big companies' treasurer are sitting there wondering where to invest the cash, and the supplier is maybe going bankrupt. So I think this is a paradigm shift. We cannot think like this. It's a wrong way of thinking, because management is incentivized on EBITDA or profits over working capital, so keep the working capital down, that you have to see working capital and measure that over the supply chain. Because if you push it, the cost to manufacture this stuff will be more, because you have interest rate costs, other kind of costs that has to add on the price to the end consumer. So
understood.
This slide you now have up, I think I don't buy into that. I think that is baloney.
Okay. Well,
so
well, you know what? And it's always good to call baloney here. So I'll go to you, Tony, very quickly. And hearing what Magnus has said, what are your thoughts in terms of this? Because you use an interesting term, convergence of physical and virtual supply chain. We're at that crossroads now. I mean, what's the answer to make it work?
Yeah, I'd say three things that are becoming clear. I think first off, every business in the world is waking up to realize that your supply chain is your business today. It's not a back office. It's not a separate function. We know the name Tim Cook not because he's a designer of products or an engineer. He is a genius at supply chain management, and that's how he got to be the CEO of the most valuable company in the world. So this is now the moment in the sun for, this issue to come together. I'm a believer that technological change precedes cultural change. So I think some of the new technologies, some of the things that are happening are going to enable some cultural change that will ultimately lead to this collaboration that we're all describing. Collaboration is a little like art. It's difficult to describe, but you know it when you see it. And I think some of these are going to be best practices from a business point of view. Some of these are going to be, I like the way earlier Magnus talked about there's a contractual side of this thing and then there's the relationship side of this thing. And I think that really is the crux of the issue here. So I think the future is going to require some probably implementation of perhaps existing, if not newer technologies. But I also think it's part of the disconnect we're seeing in some of the data, John, is really a reflection of this early stage. It's the 8th grade dance phase of collaboration, where it's awkward and a little uncomfortable. But I think we're going to look back in a few years and realize the idea that finance and procurement would have different approaches to this is lunacy. They've got to collaborate. And there are other functions that need to collaborate as a part of the supply chain strategy, too.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you for your day. We ran a little bit over time by about a minute, but, again, I wish we had an extra hour. But thank you, Magnus Lind, and, of course, Tony Uppa for joining us. One final word before we sign off. I just want to share with you that Horizon 2018 is just around the corner, October 28th to 30th, where procurement intellect meets digital technology. I think that sort of comes to your convergence comment, Tony. So I want to remind everybody to check that out and register as well. Experts like Gartner, Forrester, the Hackett Group, and Span Matters, some of which we cited in these slides here, will be there as well, and yours truly will be there. But thank you to everyone for joining us. And again, I'd encourage you to certainly download the on-demand and version of this webinar and share it far and wide. And again, to you, Tony, to you, Magnus, thank you for much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.